Greetings everyone, it's been a while and a lot has happened since last time. Long story short, I managed to land a job and effectively felt like I didn't have the time anymore to prepare a video that would meet my own expectations, so I just dropped making videos altogether, despite having finished a large proportion of the work for the next video I had planned to do. I apologize for not at least letting you know what's happening, although I assume that nobody was on the edge of their seat waiting for a new video of mine. That's not what I'm here to talk about though. I want to share some image material and stories of my trip to Japan in April of 2019. Going there has been a dream of mine as long as I can think. As a matter of fact, I've almost waited 20 years for it to become a reality. Much like for many people of my generation, anime and Japanese-made video games were my initial point of contact with Japanese culture, and as time went on, I learned about more and more aspects of it. Gradually, I became increasingly invested in learning about the way of life in Japan, the customs and traditions, food, and I even started learning some of the language, but I'm still far away from being able to hold an actual conversation in Japanese. Consequently, a more detailed, clearer, and more realistic picture of life in Japan formed in my head and replaced the one that was shaped only by their in some cases wacky and over-the-top media. Before getting straight to it, because I have a lot to cover, keep in mind that the images and video footage were not taken with the intent of making a video like this, and I have little experience using a camera in general, so not only could the footage and pictures appear amateuresque at times, because they clearly are, but I also might have to use supplementary image or video material from other sources to fill in gaps here and there. My journey technically started on the 12th of April. My flight was scheduled to leave relatively early the next morning at Frankfurt Airport, early enough that I had to make my way there a day in beforehand and take a hotel room for the night. After buying what might possibly be the world's most expensive Pepsi at the hotel lobby and writing a job interview related email in my room, I turned in for the night. The next morning I left the hotel extra early and took the shuttle bus to my terminal, so I would definitely have enough time to check in and get through the security screening. And yet I ended up cutting it closer than expected. First off, I got off the bus at the wrong terminal because I had misremembered the number of the actual terminal I was supposed to be at. No big deal. I checked my tickets and noticed the mistake, and after some walking arrived at my destination. Now all that was left to do was find a check-in counter, right? I looked for a solid 15 minutes but wasn't able to find a counter for Etihad flights. Eventually I ended up asking the staff and they told me to go down the hallway, take the next turn right and head for a certain counter number. At the indicated turn, out of the corner of my eye I must have seen the counter number listed below an arrow pointing in the opposite direction, since immediately after turning right I felt something was off, but I continued anyways, putting my trust in the directions I was given. I spotted a long queue and figured that maybe I was in the right spot after all. That relief, however, was short-lived, as immediately after rounding another corner when the line moved forward, I realized that people were actually queuing for a security checkpoint which I wasn't able to see earlier. Now I was sandwiched between people and didn't really see an unproblematic way out without bothering everyone, so I stayed in there a little longer until I passed another staff member and was able to explain my situation to them. They let me out and pointed me in the right direction, and then I finally found a check-in counter, which is where my next problem occurred. The handle of this rolling suitcase I was using was already a bit damaged in a manner that would make it hard to push it back into the holder after extending it for its intended use. So there I am at the check-in counter, done with all the formalities, showing the lady my passport and receiving my boarding passes, and when it's time to put my suitcase on the conveyor belt, the handle will just not budge. Embarrassed, I try my best to get it fixed quickly, but the handle is not cooperating. After what feels like an eternity and many awkward statements along the lines of, "Haha, this suitcase is already a bit old," and "I'm so sorry for disrupting the flow of the line," etc., I finally managed to push the handle back in and I'm on my way. Keep in mind that at this point I've been walking from one spot to the next for quite some time, all while being stressed, carrying or rather dragging around a heavy suitcase plus hand luggage, and still wearing my coat that was a little too thick for the weather conditions on that day, so I broke into a bit of a sweat. And by a bit of a sweat, I mean I was sweating so much that the guy at the security checkpoint who patted me down was visibly disgusted by my drenched shirt. The rest of the outbound trip was a lot less problematic. A 6-hour flight to Abu Dhabi and afterwards another 10-hour flight to Narita Airport, which by the way is almost a 40-minute train ride away from central Tokyo. I had a little trouble navigating through the subway system at first, but it was not nearly as cumbersome as the aforementioned ordeal. Eventually I arrived at my Airbnb, my host showed me the flat, gave me a tour of the neighborhood, and only then, after being awake for more than 24 hours, I could finally get some rest in my futon. My actual first day started with a trip to Kabukicho, since at the time I had just gotten into the Yakuza games and wanted to see the real-life inspiration for Kamurocho. And as a matter of fact, you'll recognize a lot of the landmarks featured in the game, such as the Shinjuku Toho building, aka the Millennium Tower, the Cinecity or Theater Square, and the parking lot on Hanamichidori and Shichifuku Street respectively. I headed further south until I reached the shopping center known as Takashimaya Times Square, which in and of itself is nothing special, but it offered access to a rooftop terrace that provided a nice view of the nearby Shinjuku Gyoen Park, which I then decided would be my next destination. It is sprawled out over an area of 58.3 hectares and boasts over 20,000 trees as well as 1,500 subtropical and tropical plants that are found within the park's greenhouse. Gardens in the French formal, the English and traditional Japanese style, together with the various ponds and pavilions, further add to the park's sense of peacefulness and charm. It also serves as a popular cherry blossom viewing spot. As indicated by the name Shinjuku Gyoen, the park used to be under the management of the Imperial Household Agency of Japan before the administration fell into the hands of the Ministry of Environment in 2001, and as such it was selected as the location for the funeral rites of Emperor Hirohito. After taking a good look around the park, I took the subway to Akihabara, the weeb mecca, the promised land, the gamer's paradise, to gather some first impressions. That is, I didn't do much in terms of browsing shops and playing games in arcades, but I already knew at that point that I would return to this place many times during my vacation, so it was sufficient to round off a good first day. Day 2 was dedicated to the must-see sites, namely the Shibuya Crossing and the East Gardens of the Imperial Palace. The Shibuya Crossing is one of the busiest intersections in the world, and during peak times up to 2,500 people may cross it during a single traffic signal cycle. I personally wanted to observe it from a nice spot where I could get a better look at all the people going about their business, so I made my way to the observation deck of a nearby shopping center. Not only did I get a good view of the hustle and bustle, but I was also able to spot some of the other noteworthy locations and buildings in the vicinity, such as the famous Shibuya 109 department store or the statue of Hachiko. Hachiko was a dog who has become known to the general public by means of his continued loyalty to his owner Hidesaburo Ueno. Even after his passing, Hachiko would visit Shibuya Station, where the two had previously met each day after the former's commute home from work, daily for 9 years up until his own death, anticipating Ueno's return. As for the East Gardens of the Imperial Palace, there's way too much history behind this place to cover it even on a surface level, as the palace is located on the former grounds of Edo Castle that was built initially in 1457 and served as the residence of the Tokugawa shoguns throughout the entire Edo period. So let me just give you an overview of what I saw with potentially some extra info sprinkled in here and there. Before actually entering the East Gardens, I checked out the Kokyo-Gaien National Garden, specifically the area near the Sakurada Gate in the south, and the square close to Seimon-Ishi Bridge, connecting the plaza and the inner palace grounds. Further behind that bridge, the same section of the moat is bridged by the Nihonbashi, which leads from one part of the inner palace grounds to the palace reception hall. This steel bridge used to be made of wood and was reinforced with additional wooden beams forming a sort of double bridge, hence the name Nihonbashi. The East Gardens themselves used to encompass the 3 innermost circles of defense of the Edo Castle, the main circle Honmaru and the secondary and tertiary circle Ninomaru and Sanomaru respectively. Now you'll find a variety of interesting structures and facilities on the premises, such as the Ninomaru Gardens, which is a lovely retreat from city life and apparently contains trees representing each prefecture of Japan. Other points of interest are an octagon-shaped music hall which was built in honor of Empress Gojun's 60th birthday on March 6, 1963, the foundation of the former castle tower, the Suwanochaya Tea House, the Fujimi Tamon Defense House, where Fujimi stands for Mount Fuji is viewable, the Fujimi Yagura Turret, and last but not least, the Sanomaru Museum. In this building, various imperial household treasures are displayed, and amongst others I saw poems written by the imperial couple themselves. Little did I know at the time that the Emperor Akihito was scheduled to retire just 2 weeks later on April 30th, close to the end of my vacation. I ended day 2 with another quick visit to Akihabara and a chopped fatty tuna, scallion rice bowl and udon combo meal. Not bad, but nothing to write home about. Day 3 ended up being a rather short one as I spent most of it rehearsing for a job interview that I had in the evening via Skype. It didn't go too bad, however it didn't end up being the position that I would work in later down the line. There's more to the story than simply not getting accepted, but I won't go into that right now. The evening, however, was more vacation-like as I visited the observation deck of the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building near Shinjuku Station. It was a view to behold, however, due to the lighting and the reflection of the observation deck interior in the windows, the videos and pictures I took aren't really doing it justice. The following day led me to a location featured in one of my favorite visual novel series, Kara no Shoujo, namely Inokashira Park. Next to this park just so happened to also be a zoo where I spent most of my day. While it is smaller in size than both the Ueno Zoo and Tama Zoo, and houses fewer animal species, it is specialized in species native to Japan such as Japanese squirrels, serows, Japanese martens, or black-faced spoonbills, and is also committed to their conservation by applying a variety of breeding techniques. Other noteworthy locations within the zoo include the Japanese Garden, the Squirrel Trail, as well as a museum with a variety of different sculptures, the Aquatic Center, and a guinea pig petting zoo. Also, another trip to Akihabara rounded off the day. By now you should have realized that as a fan of anime and games, this was my feel-good place that I would often visit, and this time around I even snagged myself Nosferatu for Super Famicom and an Azure Lane-themed gachapon. Day 5 brought me to the man-made island of Odaiba that is home to not only the Fuji TV building, but also many shopping malls, the indoor amusement park Joypolis, the Uedo Onsen Monogatari, and the National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation, or Miraikan. Even getting there was a pretty interesting experience as the Yurikamome line, which originates at Shimbashi Station, traverses the spiral ramp of the Rainbow Bridge and crosses the latter to present the passengers a nice view of Tokyo Bay. I started off walking from the north end of Odaiba Beach towards the replica of the Statue of Liberty on the south side. Along the way there were several platforms parallel to the Odaiba Marine Park Pier, allowing you to take in your surroundings. It was a nice day. I had just had my lunch, 7-Eleven sandwiches to be precise, most likely of the egg or pork cutlet variety since those over the time emerged as my clear favorites, and now I was standing in this tranquil spot with the sun's rays blessing me with pleasant warmth. At that moment all my worries melted away and I felt truly happy about my decision to come here. The aforementioned Odaiba Marine Park Pier is by the way also a stop of the Tokyo Water Bus, many of whose lines will take you up the Sumida River all the way to Asakusa, which I also visited later that day. Behind me towered the Fuji TV building, which for the first time caught my attention years prior when I watched Digimon Adventure due to the peculiar ball shape of its observation platform. The anime in question in fact faithfully portrayed several locations all throughout Tokyo, like the Shimbashi Station, the Tokyo Big Sight aka the Tokyo International Exhibition Center, Shinjuku Station, the nearby Lumine Shopping Center, and more. Since my memories of the Fuji TV building in particular reached so far back, and due to the fact that in the meantime I had associated it with other shows out of the station, such as the popular Game Center CX featuring Inokashira, I just had to pay it a visit. The observation deck was at the time also the location of a small display centered around Chibi Maruko-chan in honor of the 30th anniversary of the anime, of which I had seen a couple of episodes when I was younger, but wasn't overly familiar with. Afterwards, I headed to some of the shopping centers in the vicinity, so of course more gaming was on the agenda. Out of all of the game centers I visited during my trip, I think the Odaiba Game Hall, located within the DEX Tokyo Beach Complex, was one of my favorites. Not only the selection of games was fantastic, with a variety of pinball machines and carnival-esque games, as well as classics such as Outrun, Virtual Cop 2, Super Hang-On, The House of the Dead, Street Fighter 2, etc., but also the entire aesthetic of the place that was reminiscent of a 1950s American diner. In a typical Japanese arcade, you'll find your crane games, a plethora of rhythm games, entire rows of Fate Grand Order arcade machines, maybe a selection of fighting games, and perhaps some light gun shooters. These games of course have their rightful place, but plenty of them require a lot of practice and/or a deeper understanding of the mechanics to really get the full experience, something which is not exactly easy to acquire within a short period of time. Hence why I prefer games that are easier to just pick up and play, which were more commonly found in this particular game center. There was a lot more to see and do in Odaiba, but my final destination ended up being the life-sized Unicorn Gundam statue, just behind the Diver City Tokyo Plaza. Whether or not you're a fan of Gundam, this gargantuan hunk of future technology will knock your socks off, and as such a diverse group with people of all ages was gathered enjoying the monstrosity facing them. I then made my way north to the Asakusa Sensoji Temple, which I might not have given the time it really deserved since daylight had already mostly faded by the time I arrived there. Seeing this historic structure at night with the modern Tokyo skytree in the background was impressive in its own right, however. I arrived at the Kaminarimon or Thunder Gate on the south side of the temple grounds. Any person with even a little interest in the sights of Tokyo will probably have laid eyes on images of this gate at some point. It's that famous, featured even in the visual novel Go-Go Nippon. Wait a second, that doesn't seem right. Anyways, after inspecting the Shinto gods Fujin and Raijin that embellish the front side of the gate posts, I continued down Nakamisedori, a street leading up to the temple with a large number of different shops selling mostly tourist goods. It was there that I finally found some postcards that I could send to people after having looked for them on the previous days unsuccessfully. At the end of the road, the two-story treasure house gate or Hozumon marks a final point of interest before entering the inner temple complex, where the respective gate posts are adorned by two statues that represent the Neo, that is, the guardian deities of Buddha, each 5.45 meters in height. You might wonder why the Kaminarimon and the Hozumon display deities of both Shinto and Buddhism. Aside from the fact that in Japan, Shinto and Buddhism in general were never strictly separated, even though the separation was pushed for by the Meiji government, this fact is related to the origin of the temple, which is constituted by the discovery of a Buddha statue in the Sumida River by two fishermen brothers in 628 AD. The intellectual and chief of their village, Nakatomo Hajino Atai, identified the statue for what it was, and in 645 AD the first temple was founded. The three of them are honored at the Asakusa Shrine located east of Sensoji Temple within the inner complex. The temple was destroyed and rebuilt several times over the centuries leading up to the present day. Most recently it had been demolished as a result of the World War II Tokyo air raid on March 10, 1945 and reconstructed in 1958 as a symbol of rebirth and peace for the people of Japan. On my way home, I had a pleasant meal at a nearby restaurant and did some shopping at Don Quixote. Normally this wouldn't even be worth mentioning, but the appearance of the building made it look like it was another one of Asakusa's major sites. The agenda of day 6 was a lot less packed than that of the previous day, mainly because I didn't have any particular destination in mind, but rather wanted to just get a general feel of the areas I went to. The first of them was Ueno Park. I knew of the aforementioned Ueno Zoo, of course, but since I had been to Inokashira Park Zoo just a couple of days earlier, I decided to pass on that for the moment. I eventually ended up stumbling across the Ueno Toshogu Peony Garden. Not being much of a flower connoisseur, I settled with taking in the general atmosphere and beauty of the place and thinking about a variety of things that were occupying my mind at that moment. One of those things was a moment that I got to witness earlier during the day while I had my lunch. An old man took it upon himself to feed presumably stray cats in the park, which was quite heartwarming to watch. I'm not one to hold a camera into people's faces, so I opted not to capture it on video, but I thought I would at least give that man my tip of the hat. At the garden's exit, I got a better look at the nearby 5-storied pagoda of Kanneji that had previously already caught my attention. Kanneji is a temple that was founded in 1625 by the monk named Tenkai of the Tendai school of Buddhism and the Edo period's third shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu, who by the way was also responsible for the reconstruction of the Hosomon in Asakusa in 1636, of the Kaminarimon in 1649, as well as for the establishment of the Asakusa Shrine in the same year. The temple served as the second family temple of the Tokugawa next to Sojoji and was almost completely destroyed in the Boshin War during the Battle of Ueno, in which roughly 2,000 men of the shogunate put up a last stand in the area, in spite of the fact that at that point Edo was almost completely occupied by revolutionary forces and the majority of the Bakufu troops had already surrendered. On the premises of Kanneji, there is also the Shinto shrine Toshogu, to which the pagoda in question was dedicated by Toshikatsu Doi, a high-ranking member of the Tokugawa shogunate. However, with the Meiji restoration came the policy to separate Shinto, which was to become the official state religion, from Buddhism. Since pagodas were originally buildings associated with Buddhism, those owned by Shinto shrines should therefore be destroyed. In an attempt to preserve the building, the Toshogu chief priest declared it property of Kanneji, which proved to be successful. I looked around Ueno Park a little longer and then moved northwards towards Yanaka Cemetery to get a glimpse of the final resting place of Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun of the Edo period. Finally, I visited the business district Nihonbashi. I was attracted by the architecture of the Nihonbashi stone bridge displayed in pictures in my travel guide, and the promise of many shopping malls in the area. While the former was nice enough, the malls weren't nearly as interesting as those in Odaiba, in my opinion at least, and therefore I didn't spend that much time in the area. Other places of interest in Nihonbashi include the Bank of Japan and the Tokyo Stock Exchange, which I didn't seek out specifically. On my way back, I came across Fukutoku Shrine, which was supposedly established in the Heian period and is said to be a center of divine energy for winning the lottery. It houses the deity Ukano Mitama no Mikoto, the god of rich harvest, who was worshipped by the first Tokugawa shogun Ieyasu and his successors. Day 7 was the first occasion on which I left Tokyo, as I was headed to Yokosuka. A quick warning in advance, in this section I'll be talking a lot about Japan's history, so if that's not your thing and you're only here for the nice vacation pics and videos, skip to the timestamp displayed on screen now. What brought me to this city, you may ask? One word: Shenmue. I have been a big fan of the Shenmue series for almost a decade, which, for the true veterans and hardcore fans of the franchise, may seem like rookie numbers, but it was enough to inspire me to see some of the famous locations of the game in real life. Speaking of Shenmue, during my YouTube absence, Shenmue 3 finally released, and honestly, while I don't think it compares to Part 1 or 2, it wasn't a disappointment to me that many people online make it out to be. Anyways, it was a comparatively long trip to my destination. Taking the Yokosuka line from Tokyo Station, I spent just over an hour on the train. The Yokosuka station is directly adjacent to Verny Park, dedicated as the name suggests to François-Léonce Verny, a French naval engineer who was involved in an effort to modernize the Japanese military, which was initiated by the shogunate and not only continued in the Meiji era, but vastly intensified. The motivation for this effort was due to US Navy Commodore Matthew Perry arriving at Uraga at the entrance of the Bay of Edo with 4 steam-powered warships with the goal of forcing Japan, which had been engaged in a policy of isolationism ever since 1639, to open up for trade with the West. He presented the Japanese with a letter of the US president stating their demands and threatened to vanquish them should they choose to fight. Abe Masahiro, the leader of the shogunate's council of elders known as Rōju, was effectively in charge of the administration at the time due to the shogun Tokugawa Ieyoshi having fallen ill. With the absence of the shogun and the nature of the threat that presented itself to the capital in the form of vessels that featured large paddle wheels, a black hull, and ran on steam engines which discharged black smoke billows, hence the name Kurofune or black ships, the government was all but immobilized. After some contemplation, Perry's letter was accepted, as the act of accepting the letter alone was deemed to not violate the sovereignty of Japan. In light of the shogun's illness, Japan requested and was granted a period of 1 year to come to an answer. Abe recognized that Japan's defenses were no match against the intruder's military capabilities. Furthermore, mere days after Perry's departure, the shogun passed away and his brother Tokugawa Ieyasu assumed the position, who however also suffered from extremely poor health, which saw Abe Masahiro continue leading the shogunate government. Qing China served as an example of how an armed conflict against an opponent with superior military capabilities, namely the First Opium War against Britain, could lead to the complete loss of sovereignty over foreign trade and territorial secessions, and thus the shogunate was eager to strike a deal with the Americans. Abe and the Rōju were still hesitant to make any major decisions, not least because the exclusion of foreigners at the time enjoyed a large backing within Japan. In an unprecedented move, various groups including feudal lords or daimyo, the hatamoto, that is, the samurai who directly served the shogunate, and even commoners were polled with regards to their opinion on Japan's diplomatic policy. The results, however, turned out inconclusive, and the perceived display of weakness and indecisiveness by the shogunate also undermined the government's position, since it popularized the concept of a parliamentary regime. In any case, upon Perry's return, the Conference of Kanagawa was held, in which, after a month of negotiating, the Treaty of Peace and Amity was presented to him by the officials of the shogun. While not all the conditions of the treaty were approved of by Perry, he postponed resolving his issues with them to a later point in time, and the treaty was finally signed on March 31, 1854. A consul of the United States that remained in Japan negotiated a more permanent agreement in the following years, which brought about the Harris Treaty that was signed on July 29, 1858. To get back on track from this massive tangent though, the arrival of the black ships is essentially what started the modernization of the Japanese military, and Verny in particular was responsible for the direction of the Yokosuka naval arsenal's construction. Moreover, Verny also held a managing role in the construction of the shipyard in Nagasaki, as well as of 4 lighthouses in the Tokyo area. From Verny Park, I moved on to Dobuita Street, which is the main shopping street in town and also a major location in Shenmue 1. As suggested by the game, the town is strongly shaped by American influences, which is due to the fact that after World War II, occupying American forces landed at Yokosuka on August 30, 1945, and its naval base has been used by the US Navy ever since. You'll find a lot of American bars and restaurants, perhaps encounter Navy personnel, and some shops will even accept US dollars. Other destinations on Dobuita Street include the many clothing shops that among other things sell sukajan or souvenir jackets, which are inspired by baseball jackets and feature embroidery, often with Japanese themed motifs. They originate from the light jackets that US soldiers in Yokosuka used to create from parachute cape leftovers that themselves resembled American university jackets. Prior to departing, US soldiers commemorated their time in Japan by enhancing their jackets by means of embroidery, with motifs representing both Japanese and American culture, as well as symbols of military life. With the Yokosuka Mambo fashion movement, clothing items that combined elements of the military and civilian style became popular, the sukajan or Yokosuka jumper in particular. The 1961 movie Butato Gunkan, aka Pigs and Battleships, largely contributed to spreading its popularity all over Japan. After having a delicious burger for dinner, I aimlessly explored the town until I happened to stumble upon Mikasa Park, anchoring ground of the memorial ship IJ and Mikasa, which I promptly decided to inspect. In order to get a better picture of the significance of this ship, we need to go back to the previously discussed efforts to modernize the Japanese military. Part of these efforts encompassed having various military missions by a number of European nations travel to Japan to train the nation's forces in the state-of-the-art warfare. The earliest of these took place in 1855 and was led by the Royal Dutch Navy officer Pels Regen, who was assigned to teach at the Nagasaki Naval Training Center. It is noteworthy that this military mission also brought a gift from Dutch King William III to Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu in form of what would later become known as Japan's first steam-powered warship, Kanko Maru. Not least because, much like Commodore Perry, the Dutch were trying to negotiate the opening of Japanese ports to Dutch merchant ships. 3 other military missions would head to Japan in the final years of the shogunate, the first of which was led by Regen's countryman Willem Hausen van Kattendijke in 1857, who replaced the former in his current position, and the other 2 were undertaken just 1 year before the Meiji Restoration, meaning in 1867. The Second French Empire under Napoleon III and the United Kingdom sent missions headed by Captain Charles-Sulpice Jules Chanoine and Royal Navy Commander Sir Richard Tracy respectively. Despite these efforts, the dissatisfaction with the shogunate grew, especially amongst nobles and young samurai, owing to the poor handling of the Black Ship incident and the subsequently increasing westernization of Japan. Samurai from the domains of Tosa, Satsuma and Choshu banded together and in cooperation with officials from the imperial court managed to seize control over the latter and exert influence on the then only 14-year-old Emperor Meiji. His father, Emperor Komei, who generally enjoyed high respect by anti-Bakufu forces but took a strict stance against their ambitions to force change by violence, died in 1867 by smallpox, which in a way was quite convenient for them. Therefore, it was even speculated whether he was assassinated by radicals in the movement, but proof to support the claim was never found. The ruling shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu realized his precarious situation and for the sake of ensuring a position for the House Tokugawa in the future government transferred political power to the emperor. Ultimately, the shogun saw himself forced to launch a military campaign with the aim of seizing the imperial court in Kyoto as a result of several factors, such as the issuing of a decree by the domains Satsuma and Choshu that announced the abolishment of the House Tokugawa, military movements of the imperial forces, as well as partisan violence that occurred in Edo. I already mentioned the outcome of this war earlier being the victory of the imperial forces, which was facilitated by them having been heavily modernized due to support by the United Kingdom and the United States, eliminating their numerical deficit, and led to the restoration of the emperor to power. The Meiji government soon set in motion measures to achieve large-scale economic reform as it recognized that the upkeep of a military, modern in nature as the one that all but decided the war for them, would require an appropriate economy to support it. Transforming a feudal society into an industrial nation was no small feat. However, matching the technological standards of the most advanced European nations at the time was achieved within a comparatively small time frame. Less than 40 years, in fact, if we view the forced opening of the country in 1854 as a result of the Kanagawa Treaty as a starting point. One step towards this goal was the abolishment of the samurai class and the daimyo-ruled feudal domains. Even more important than that, though, was the continuous strengthening of the country's infrastructure by means of constructing assets such as ports, railroads, as well as telegraph lines. Moreover, the government established the public corporation Tomioka Villager, which, as implied by the name, created thread by spinning and thus served as a foundation for the textile industry. In addition, the heavy and various chemical industries were developed, and for many of these industries, foreign technologies had gradually been imported since the Kurofune incident. Experts from the West were also sent to the locations in question to provide necessary guidance. Another economically important phenomenon whose roots lie in the Meiji era is the rise of the so-called Zaibatsu. No, not the GTA 2 faction, but rather conglomerates of various companies along the supply chain for specific services or products, with a family-owned holding company at the top and an own bank to finance subsidiaries. Many of these Zaibatsu had ties to the major political parties of the time and even branches of the military. For instance, the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu was associated with the Rikken Minseto and the Imperial Japanese Navy. In other words, they wielded a significant amount of power. The infrastructure development, combined with the formation and/or expansion of industries, brought about a positive feedback loop in which the better infrastructure enabled a larger number of wares and people to be transported. The companies subsequently could increase their market and the demand for their products, their production, and ultimately their profit, meaning the government was also able to collect greater revenue in taxes, which in turn was again invested into infrastructure. On a different front, the government also reformed its structure to resemble the one of Prussia. The year 1875 saw the introduction of the Supreme Court of Judicature, which separated the government's legislative and judicial powers. The legislature also was drastically modernized with the establishment of the Imperial Diet or Teikoku Gikkai, consisting of the House of Representatives and the House of Peers, and provisioned in the Meiji Constitution of 1889. Which by the way also granted basic rights to all Japanese citizens. Now that we know how the modernization of Japan and its military came about, how is it related to the IJN Mikasa? Well, Japan thought it to be necessary for the sake of the nation's development and protection to expand its territory by assuming control over certain areas rich in raw materials. Consequently, Japan had its first opportunities to put its modernized military to the test by engaging in armed conflicts with Qing China in the First Sino-Japanese War and with Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. As only the latter pertains to the IJN Mikasa, I won't go into details about the First Sino-Japanese War. However, in summary, it was primarily fought over influence on the Korean peninsula and thus was carried out in Korea, but also in Manchuria as well as Taiwan, and ended with the crushing defeat of Qing China. Contrary to the expectations of Western nations who saw the Chinese, which had also undertaken efforts to modernize their military, as favorites to win the war. The subsequently formed Treaty of Shimonoseki determined that the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan and Pangchu were to become Japanese territories, and Korea would gain independence from China. At the same time, however, it fell into Japan's sphere of influence before ultimately being placed under Japanese occupation in 1910. Germany, France and Russia, in response to the harsh terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, under the threat of war, forced Japan to relinquish its claim to the Liaodong Peninsula, as all nations had active ports and enclaves in China, and the Russian Empire in particular desired to establish Port Arthur in said peninsula as their main Pacific stronghold. This warm water port was an especially desirable target for the Russian Empire, as unlike their other ports on the Pacific such as Vladivostok, it would be operational all year round as opposed to only in the summer months. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan identified the weaknesses of its naval strategies and prepared for potential future armed conflicts. A 10-year strengthening program of the naval forces was announced that amongst others encompassed the construction of 6 battleships, one of them being the IJN Mikasa, and 6 armored cruisers, which was paid for by the compensation received from China as part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Owing to the fact that Japan was not in a position of constructing its own battleships, despite all modernization measures, it turned to the Vickers shipbuilding yard located in Barrow in Furness, from which the Mikasa, as the final one of the 6 battleships to be constructed, was ordered in 1898. Its construction commenced in January 1899 and it was commissioned on March 1, 1902. In light of Russia's past efforts to expand their territory, specifically in Siberia and the Far Eastern region, Japan was concerned that their plan of gaining and maintaining a firm hold over Manchuria and Korea respectively might be in jeopardy. In negotiations, Japan demanded to have its dominance over Korea recognized while in return offering to acknowledge Russia's preeminence in Manchuria. However, the proposal was denied and met with a counter-proposition of establishing a buffer zone north of the 39th parallel. In the end, the diplomatic route did not yield any results, and Japan, whose concerns hadn't been alleviated, made the decision to go to war. And so, on the 8th of February 1904, the Russian Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur was struck in a surprise attack. The attack was carried out by the IJN First Fleet led by Admiral Togo Heiachiro, which included the battleship Mikasa. While the surprise attack didn't inflict as much damage to the Russian Pacific Fleet as Togo had hoped initially, as many of the torpedoes fired by Japanese destroyers were either caught in torpedo nets, failed to explode, or missed their targets, the Russian protected cruiser Pallada and the battleships Redvisan and Cesarevich were disabled, the latter of which was considered to be the most powerful battleship of the fleet. No ships were sunk on either side. Fortunately for the Japanese, however, the capabilities of the Russian fleet to perform repairs at Port Arthur were limited, whereas they were able to use the dry dock facilities at the Sasebo Naval Arsenal. The attack on Port Arthur created an opening for Japanese forces to land in Incheon, from where they moved on to occupy Hansong, that is today's Seoul, and by April had advanced to the Yalu River at the Chinese-Korean border. The IJN Mikasa was also involved in the blockade of Port Arthur, particularly in the events of the 13th of April, in which a proportion of the Imperial Russian Navy's 1st Pacific Squadron was baited to leave the port, the flagship Petropavlovsk included. Upon spotting the IJN's First Fleet battleships, the Petropavlovsk decided to return to Port Arthur, however ended up running into a minefield that was set up by Japanese forces the night before, resulting in an explosion of one of its magazines, causing it to sink within mere minutes. The next major engagement of the Mikasa was the Battle of the Yellow Sea on the 10th of August. On land, the Japanese forces had in the meantime inflicted a large number of defeats on the Russians, shattering their notion that the war would be short-lived and victory all but guaranteed. As a matter of fact, the outcome of the first major land battle of the war at the Yalu River marked the first victory of an Asian power over a European one in modern times. As for the sea battle in question, it came about as a result of the Russian order to break out of Port Arthur and join the squadron stationed in Vladivostok, given to the newly appointed commander of the battle fleet, Wilhelm Wittgeft, after the previous commander, Stepan Makarov, had died alongside with the majority of the Petropavlovsk crew. During this battle, the Russian fleet was initially headed towards the southwest, to which Admiral Togo, once the intentions of the enemy had become clear to him, reacted with positioning his fleet west of the Russians in an attempt to prevent their return to port and to cap their tea, meaning that their fleet, advancing in a line formation, was to be met with a line of battleships perpendicular to and with their broadsides facing the former. This strategy allows the fleet crossing the T to utilize all of their guns, while the fleet advancing in a line can only use their front-facing guns. In this particular instance, though, the speed of the Japanese fleet was miscalculated, enabling the Russians to conduct a rapid turn to port and continue towards the southeast, meaning the Japanese ships had to engage in a stern chase. While initially both fleets were absorbing hits, the Russians were steadily making their way towards the southeast. However, the tide of the battle turned when the bridge of the flagship Cesarevich was struck, killing Admiral Wittgeft as well as his command staff and causing the ship to perform a hard port turn due to its wheel being jammed. Other Russian ships tried to follow suit until it became apparent that the flagship had lost control, but the fleet was already out of formation at that point. As Togo's fleet was approaching in order to finish off the flagship, the Russian battleship Redvisan made a charge towards the Japanese battle line, drawing their fire towards itself and thus not only protecting the Cesarevich, but also buying the remainder of the fleet enough time to return to Port Arthur. In essence, the Japanese therefore managed to achieve a strategic victory in this very first battle in naval history between modern steel battleship fleets. The flagship IJN Mikasa had taken 20 hits in the battle, 125 of its crew members were killed, and the 12-inch gun at the stern was knocked out. The final naval battle of the Russo-Japanese War, the Battle of Tsushima, took place on the 27th of May 1905. Around mid-April the previous year, just after the Petropavlovsk had sunk and the Russians' arguably most capable officer Makarov had been killed, the decision was made to dispatch the Baltic Fleet to the Far East in an attempt to strengthen the Pacific Squadron. Due to the ships of the Baltic Fleet having been outfitted over the summer and encountering engine problems, they did not embark on their long journey that would lead them around the Cape of Good Hope, and thus around half the world, until the 15th of October 1904. The journey posed many challenges for the Russian Baltic Fleet. For one thing, their ships were neither designed to cover such extreme distances nor to operate in the tropical conditions they would encounter in certain areas. Secondly, Russia didn't have any refueling bases along the way, and in accordance with the rules of war couldn't be provided aid to an extent they would have required. This problem was aggravated by the fact that Russia did not enjoy much popularity amongst imperial powers. Britain in particular, who was in control of a large number of bases and ships on the scheduled route, had previously formed the Anglo-Japanese alliance, thus provided the Japanese forces with intelligence about the Russians, and also acted as a deterrent for Russia's allies to intervene in the war. Russia's quote-unquote solution to the refueling issue consisted in chartering freighters from the Hamburg-America line that were to refuel the Baltic Fleet, now renamed to the 2nd Pacific Squadron and led by the Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rozhestvensky, either at neutral ports or at sea. This, however, came with its own set of problems, mainly that the task of refueling ships tied up at port presented itself as not only challenging and exhausting, but also dangerous, and the alternative option of refueling a fleet of this size at sea had never before been realized. Since Tsar Nicholas II was not willing to give up Russia's hold over the Pacific, these problems were conveniently cast aside. Reinforcements were sent by the Russians in February of 1905, who took the shorter route via the Suez Canal that some of the less technically advanced warships of the fleet that departed in October had already taken. The fleets eventually linked up at Kamsang Bay on the 9th of May 1905 and proceeded towards Vladivostok with the intent of joining the 1st Pacific Squadron. It is worth mentioning that while Russia's Baltic Fleet undertook this endeavor, the troops on land suffered additional heavy defeats. The longest-lasting land battle of the war at Port Arthur, which had commenced a couple of days prior to the start of the Battle of the Yellow Sea, namely on the 1st of August 1904, finally concluded on the 2nd of January 1905 with the fall of Port Arthur. On top of that, the Russians were defeated nearby the city of Liaoyang and at the Shahe. After an inconclusive battle near the fortified village of Sandepu at the end of January 1905, in which neither side claimed victory, the 20th February saw the beginning of the Battle of Mukden. The Japanese victory on the 10th of March meant that Japan now occupied all of southern Manchuria, while Russia was forced to retreat to the north. Going back to the activities of the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, while nearing its destination Vladivostok, it attempted to cross the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan in the night from the 26th to the 27th of May. Around 3 am, 2 lazaret ships of the Russian Baltic Fleet that had fallen behind the other ships were spotted by the Japanese auxiliary cruiser Shinanomaru, due to the former burning their lights. As the Shinanomaru was mistaken for a Russian ship, the Aryol signaled it that other Russian ships were nearby, which was promptly reported at Togo's headquarters. The combined Japanese fleet, led by the IJN Mikasa, set up at the coast near Pusan, awaiting the approaching Russian Baltic Fleet. At 1:40 p.m, the fleet spotted each other, and exactly 1 hour and 5 minutes later, the Japanese this time around successfully capped the T of the Baltic Fleet. Not only because of this strategic advantage, but also due to the fact that many warships of the Russian fleet were outdated and manned with poorly trained crews, as well as on account of the strenuousness of the Russians' journey thus far, the Japanese achieved a decisive victory. The Baltic Fleet was essentially obliterated as 6 battleships, 1 coastal defense ship and 14 other ships were sunk, 6 ships were captured, and 6 further ships found refuge in neutral ports. Only 4 ships actually reached their destination, Vladivostok. The IJN Mikasa took more than 40 hits during the battle, but the overall damage to the ship ended up being manageable. The Battle of Tsushima was followed up by a joint operation of the Japanese Navy and Army in which the island of Sakhalin was invaded, mainly with the intent of using it as a bargaining chip during peace negotiations, which started shortly after when the Russians finally sued for peace. In the Treaty of Portsmouth, which formally ended the war, mediated by US President Theodore Roosevelt, it was decided that Russia would withdraw from Manchuria, cede the leased Guangdong territory and South Sakhalin to Japan, recognize Japan's claims to Korea, and transfer the South Manchuria Railway, together with its mining concessions, to the former. This victory in the war further cemented Japan's status as a global player and an equal to Western nations. What happened to the IJN Mikasa though? Well, shortly after the war on the 12th of September, it sunk at the port of Sasebo due to a powder magazine explosion. However, it was refloated on the 6th of August the following year, repaired at the Sasebo Naval Arsenal, and put back into active service in August 1908. During World War I, Mikasa was deployed for the purpose of coastal defense and in 1923 decommissioned as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty signed on February 6, 1922, which was agreed upon by the major allies of said armed conflict in an effort to limit the tonnage of capital ships, such as battleships, aircraft carriers, as well as battle cruisers, and to decrease the naval construction so as to ultimately avoid an arms race. Instead of getting scrapped as originally planned by the Japanese government, after receiving permission from the other signing nations of the treaty, they decided on the conversion of Mikasa into a memorial ship, which included her hull being embedded in concrete. The Mikasa Preservation Society was formed, and in November 1926 the ship was opened to the public in its current location in Yokosuka before the eyes of both Admiral Togo and Crown Prince Hirohito. After the occupation of Japan following World War II, the ship was handed over to a private company and stripped of its masts and cannons. An aquarium and a dance hall were set up on the ship for entertainment purposes. However, after an initial boom they gradually lost business and Mikasa was abandoned and left to rust. It was not until 1955 when businessman John Rubin from Philadelphia, in a letter to the Japan Times, bemoaned the tragic state of the ship, that a new restoration campaign was kicked off which garnered support from not only the Japanese public, but also from Fleet Admiral Chester William Nimitz. 1961 marked the year when a now last surviving pre-dreadnought battleship was reopened in its former glory. I'm sure this was a lot to take in, but I feel the background information was important to showcase just how much history has happened in or is connected to this one spot. I went to Yokosuka as a Shenmue fan, but learned about events that significantly steered the nation into becoming the Japan we know today. While I've already covered a lot in this video, I briefly want to go over the last 2 days that I stayed in Tokyo, which were mainly spent on entertainment activities. Day 8 I spent almost entirely in the amusement park surrounding the Tokyo Dome baseball stadium, home of the Yomiuri Giants. It housed many of the attractions you'd expect, like a log ride, spinning teacups, a pirate ship, a Ferris wheel, etc. The highlight for me, however, was the Thunder Dolphin roller coaster with a height of 80 meters, making it the 10th highest coaster in the world, a 66-meter drop and a top speed of 130 km per hour. Another interesting feature of the track is the fact that it actually passes through a building at one point. I must have been on that coaster a good 20 times throughout the day. Doing so did come at a bit of a price though, as a one-day pass allowing you to go on all the rides as many times as you want sets you back about 4,200 yen or 33 euros. I don't regret the money spent, but for a park of that size where you could easily go on all rides within 3 to 4 hours, such a price isn't exactly negligible. Now, you may have heard about the extent to which Japanese staff will go to provide their customers a good experience, but have you ever been bowed to as your roller coaster train leaves the station or applauded when you return? It's as if they wanted to say, "Dang, you did a really good job not dying on that ride." Another interesting attraction was this tower where you would be lifted to the top in a metal basket, whose railings for me personally were located just slightly above the waist level, meaning only the first roughly 120 centimeters of your body were surrounded by the safety measure, and then rapidly lowered to the ground, followed by another round of this process. Don't misunderstand, I don't think the attraction is unsafe, but the positioning of the railings combined with my dislike of heights sure as hell made me imagine horror scenarios. I concluded the day by playing through the light gun shooter Ghost Squad in the park's arcade and then finally went on the big old Ferris wheel for a night view of the city. The individual booths of the ride even had karaoke machines installed if that's your thing. On my final day in Tokyo I did what I enjoyed the most, spent more time in Akihabara. I browsed shops, purchased gachapons and video games, namely Final Fight 1 and 2 and SimCity, played arcade games and even went to a Maid cafe. I feel like among Westerners, the general consensus on maid cafes from what I've seen online seems to be that they're cringe and that the conversations with the maids are not really worth it due to them being awkward owing to the staff's broken English and or due to them feeling very fake and forced. My take on the experience is that as long as you have some idea of what you're getting yourself into, the whole package can definitely be fun. You will be reciting the typical incantations that are meant to make your food taste better and be referred to as Goshujin-sama. As long as that is fair play to you, it shouldn't be a problem. I didn't actually get to chat much with the maids, and I don't know how the interactions with customers in this particular shop compare to other maid cafes. I hear activities slightly differ from place to place, but I personally didn't enter the shop with the expectation of a long one-on-one conversation, so not getting that didn't disappoint me, and besides, I was never bored at any point in time during my 1-hour stay. Naturally, I avoided potential uncomfortableness at the same time, but I can't say that you shouldn't really have the expectation that people perfectly speak your language when you go abroad in the first place, and that I personally in a conversation wouldn't mind even if they only pretended to care where I'm from, what I do for a living and so on. The effort alone to be asked such questions would make me feel appreciated as a customer. At the end of the day, you get a performance first and foremost. You might somewhat be disappointed if you're looking for that more personal connection to the staff or other customers that you might be able to get elsewhere. So what did my visit look like exactly, you may ask? I ordered a drink and a parfait, and while I enjoyed that, another customer paid for a special dancing and singing act that the rest of us, of course, also benefited from. While swinging the glow stick I was handed, another customer enthusiastically shouted along with the lyrics of the song the maid was belting out and dancing to. The drink and parfait I had came in a menu together with a parting present, in my case fashionable cat ears, and the opportunity to be able to take a photo together with one of the maids, which was also your only avenue of taking pictures as photography was otherwise not permitted. The price was a bit on the high end with 3,000 yen or 23 euros, but the uniqueness of it all made it feel like a worthwhile expense. I spent some more time in the shops until a real dinner was in order and then happily headed back to my Airbnb. While this wasn't the end of my journey, stopping here would make for a clean cut if I decide to come back to this with a second part. It really depends on if people are actually interested in hearing more, and if so, what kind of format they prefer. That is, are you interested in this in-depth look at the history of things, or should that be drastically cut back? I learned a lot during the making of this video that I hadn't even known about after I gained new information on site. As you can hopefully tell, a lot of effort went into this video, so if things are supposed to stay the way I tackle them in part 1, we won't be seeing part 2 for a while, especially in light of the fact that I have no real plan of how to continue from here anyways. I'm not going to promise another schedule that I can't stick to, but I also want to continue making videos that personally interest me and hopefully also would be something for you. Perhaps I'll either tackle a shorter project first, or pick up the other long project I was working on before my disappearance, on which I've already made a fair amount of progress. In any case, that's all for now from me. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep it classy.